The carriage stopped outside the iron gates just as the last light faded from the sky, and Elena Whitmore felt her heart pounding so hard she thought the guards standing outside could hear it. She had been told many things about the Ashbourne pack and its ruler, but nothing had prepared her for the size of the fortress rising in front of her, dark stone walls stretching higher than any building she had ever seen. Torches burned along the top of the walls, throwing long shadows across the courtyard, and somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, low and mournful, as if warning her to turn back while she still could. She could not turn back. Her father owed a debt to the Alpha King, a debt so large that the family had nothing left to give except her. When the letter arrived 3 days ago, sealed with the mark of the Ashbourne crest, her father had wept at the kitchen table, unable to look her in the eye. Elena had read the letter herself, over and over, until the words stopped making sense. One night. In exchange for one night with her, the debt would be erased, and her family would be safe. She had told herself it was a simple transaction, nothing more. The kind of thing that happened in every pack when families fell on hard times. She told herself this, even as her hands trembled on the carriage door. The driver, an older man with kind eyes who had said little during the long journey from her village, finally broke the silence between them. "You don't have to go through with it, miss," he said quietly, not looking at her, as though giving her privacy for the words. "There's still time to turn this carriage around." "There isn't," Elena said, and she was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "My father would never forgive himself, and I could never forgive myself for letting him carry that shame for the rest of his life. This is the only way." The driver said nothing more, but he helped her down from the carriage with unusual gentleness, and Elena thought she saw something like sympathy in his weathered face, before a guard stepped forward to take her from his care. A guard opened the gate for her, his face unreadable beneath the shadow of his hood. He did not speak. He simply gestured toward the entrance, and Elena stepped down onto the cold stone, her thin shoes doing little to protect her feet from the chill of the evening. She pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and followed him, forcing her chin to stay level, even though every part of her wanted to shrink into herself and disappear. The inside of the fortress was nothing like she expected. She had imagined cold stone corridors and the smell of blood, the kind of place whispered about in cautionary tales told to children who misbehaved. Instead, she found high ceilings, lit by warm firelight, tapestries depicting old battles and older victories, and a strange, heavy silence that made her footsteps sound too loud against the polished floor. Servants moved along the edges of the hallways, casting quick glances at her before looking away, as if afraid to be caught staring at the woman who had come to pay her family's debt with her body and her night. Elena kept her eyes forward. She would not give any of them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She counted her steps as she walked, a habit her mother had taught her long ago for moments, when fear threatened to overwhelm good sense, and by the time she reached 40, she found her breathing had steadied, even if her heart had not. The guard led her up a wide staircase and down a corridor lined with closed doors, until they reached one at the very end, larger than the rest, carved with the symbol of a wolf mid-howl beneath a crescent moon. He knocked twice, waited for a response that Elena did not hear, and then pushed the door open, stepping aside to let her pass. The room beyond was vast. A fire roared in a stone hearth large enough for a man to stand inside, and shelves lined with books covered one entire wall, more books than Elena had ever seen outside of a temple library. A large window stood open at the far end, letting in the cool night air, and standing beside it, looking out over the dark forest that surrounded the fortress, was a man Elena recognized immediately, though she had never seen him before in her life. Cade Ashbourne, the Alpha King. He was taller than she imagined, broad through the shoulders, dressed simply in a dark tunic that did nothing to hide the strength beneath it. His hair was black, cut short, and even from across the room Elena could feel the weight of his presence, a kind of quiet power that filled the space, without him needing to raise his voice or make a single threatening move. When he turned to look at her, she saw eyes the color of storm clouds, sharp and assessing, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "You may leave us," Cade said to the guard, his voice deep and even, betraying nothing. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and Elena was alone with the most powerful man in the region, a man whose name alone made grown warriors lower their eyes. "You're the Whitmore girl," he said. It was not a question. Elena, she said, refusing to let her voice shake. My name is Elena. Something flickered across his face, there and gone so quickly she almost thought she imagined it. He studied her for a long moment, taking in the plain traveling dress she wore, the dark circles beneath her eyes from 3 sleepless nights, the way her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, to keep them from trembling. You look like you expect me to hurt you, he said finally. Should I not? Elena asked before she could stop herself. To her surprise, something like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. No, he said. You should not. He gestured toward a chair near the fire, and after a moment of hesitation, Elena crossed the room and sat down, grateful for the warmth after the cold ride through the forest. Cade did not sit across from her the way she expected. Instead, he remained standing near the window, as though putting distance between them was somehow important to him, though she could not begin to guess why. Do you know why your father owes me this debt? He asked. Elena shook her head. Her father had never explained the details, only that it involved a business arrangement gone wrong years before she was born, a debt that had grown with each passing season until it became a burden too heavy for the family to carry any longer. Your father borrowed against Packland, Cade said, land that belonged to my father before me. When the arrangement failed, the debt passed to my house. I have let it grow for years because I saw no reason to collect it. Families struggle. That is not a crime. He paused, his jaw tightening slightly. But 3 months ago, your father came to me himself and offered a new arrangement. He offered you. Elena's stomach twisted. She had known this, of course, had read it in the letter, but hearing it spoken aloud in this cold, careful voice made it feel real in a way it had not before. I did not ask for this, Cade said, and there was something almost defensive in the way he said it, as if it mattered to him that she understood. I told your father I did not need payment in this form, he insisted. He said it was the only way he could look himself in the mirror again, knowing the debt was settled and his family was safe. So you agreed, Elena said quietly. I agreed to let you stay the night, Cade said. Nothing more happens here that you do not choose, Elena Whitmore. I want that understood before we go any further. She looked up at him then, searching his face for the cruelty she had been warned about, the ruthlessness that made other pack leaders speak his name with caution. She found none of it. Instead, she found a man who looked, for just a moment, tired, in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. Why does it matter to you what I choose? She asked. I am here to pay a debt. Isn't that the arrangement? Cade was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as though the answer might be found somewhere in the flames. Because I have spent my life being told what I must do for the good of the pack, he said finally, who I must marry, what alliances I must honor, what sacrifices I must make so that others do not have to. I will not become the kind of man who does the same thing to someone else, no matter what agreement was made before you walked through that door. Elena did not know how to respond to that. She had expected commands, perhaps even threats, disguised as politeness. She had not expected honesty, and certainly not the kind that made her chest ache with something she did not want to name.
You could have sent me away already, she said. Told my father the debt still stands, that this arrangement means nothing to you.
I could have, Cade agreed, but then your family would still owe more than they could ever repay, and you would have made this journey for nothing. He finally turned to look at her fully. Tell me something about yourself, Elena. Not about your father's debt, about you. The question caught her off guard. No one had asked her that in longer than she could remember. She thought of her small room at home, the garden she tended behind the house, the books she borrowed from the village healer whenever she could spare the time to read them. I like growing things, she said slowly, herbs mostly. My mother taught me before she passed, which plants heal and which ones harm, how to tell the difference even when they look almost the same. She hesitated, then added, I always wanted to see the forest here. The old wood, the one everyone says is thousands of years old. We were never allowed near Packland, but I used to imagine what it might look like. It looks like nothing you have ever seen, Cade said, and for the first time, real warmth entered his voice. Ancient trees taller than this fortress, moss that glows faintly at night near the old streams. My mother used to take me there when I was young, before she died. It is the only place I have ever felt at peace. What happened to her? Elena asked, then immediately regretted the question. I am sorry. That was not my place to ask. It is a fair question, Cade said, though something guarded crossed his face. I do not speak of it often. Perhaps another time, when we know each other better. Elena nodded, accepting the boundary without pressing further, and something in Cade's shoulders eased slightly at her willingness to let the matter rest. They talked for a long while after that, the fire slowly burning lower, the tension between them shifting into something Elena did not have a name for. She found herself forgetting, for stretches of time, why she had come here at all. Cade asked about her childhood, her mother's garden, the small kindnesses she offered to neighbors who could not afford proper healers. He told her, in turn, about the responsibilities that filled his days, the disputes he settled between pack members, the careful diplomacy required to keep peace with neighboring territories, the loneliness that came with a position where few people spoke to him without calculation or fear coloring their words. Everyone wants something from me, he admitted at one point, staring into the fire. Land, favor, protection, alliance. It has been a long time since anyone simply talked to me, because they wanted to understand who I am. I am not entirely sure I don't want anything from you, Elena said honestly. I want my family safe. I would be lying if I pretended otherwise. That is different, Cade said. That is not calculation. That is love. And there is nothing dishonest in wanting the people you love to be safe. Elena studied him, surprised by the simplicity and clarity of the distinction he had drawn, one she had not fully articulated even to herself. You understand people better than I expected, she said. I have had a great deal of practice learning to see past what people say to what they actually mean, Cade replied. It is a necessary skill when everyone around you has reasons to shade the truth. It was well past midnight when Cade finally rose and crossed the room, kneeling beside her chair so that his eyes were level with hers. I will not touch you tonight unless it is something you want, he said quietly. And if you want nothing more than to sleep safely until morning and then return home with your family's debt forgiven, that is exactly what will happen. You have my word as Alpha. Elena studied his face in the firelight, searching for any trace of deception and finding none. Something in her chest, something that had been clenched tight since the moment the letter arrived at her family's door, finally began to loosen. I believe you, she said softly, and she realized, with some surprise, that she meant it completely. What happened between them after that was not what either of them had expected when the night began. It was not the transaction Elena had steeled herself for, nor the burden Cade had quietly dreaded carrying out. It became something gentler, built from hours of careful conversation, and the slow unraveling of walls neither of them had meant to lower. They spoke of small things and large ones, of the books Elena loved most and the songs Cade remembered his mother singing, of dreams neither of them had voiced aloud to another living soul. When at last exhaustion pulled at Elena's eyes, Cade guided her to a bed in a chamber adjoining his own, and she fell asleep faster than she had in weeks, lulled by a strange and unfamiliar sense of safety. She did not know, as she drifted off, that Cade remained awake long into the night, standing at his window, staring out at the ancient forest his mother had once loved, feeling something stir inside him that he had not felt in all his years as Alpha. It was not simple attraction, though that was certainly part of it. It was something older, something written into the very core of who he was as a wolf, a recognition that rose from somewhere deep and instinctive, the kind of feeling the old stories described, but which he had long ago stopped believing might ever find him. He thought of his father, hollowed out by grief, ruling through duty alone for decades, because he feared what love had already cost him once. He thought of the careful walls he himself had built, brick by brick, over years of watching every person who approached him for what they might gain, rather than who he truly was. And he thought of Elena, asleep just beyond the wall separating their two rooms, who had asked him nothing except that he be honest with her, who had offered her own honesty freely in return, expecting nothing. He did not yet have a word for what he felt taking root in his chest. But he knew, with a certainty that unsettled him more than any threat or battle ever had, that when the sun rose in a few hours, he was not going to let her walk out of these gates. Elena woke slowly, the pale light of early morning filtering through the tall windows of the unfamiliar room. For a moment, she forgot where she was, disoriented by the soft bedding, and the unfamiliar scent of cedar and smoke that clung to the sheets. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up quickly, her heart beginning to race all over again. The night was over. The debt, as far as she understood the arrangement, was settled. All that remained was to gather herself, thank the Alpha King for his unexpected kindness, and return to her family before the morning grew any older. She found a simple robe laid across a chair near the bed and wrapped it around herself before stepping out into the main chamber, where she found Cade already awake, seated near the cold hearth, watching the door as though he had been waiting for her to appear. A tray of food sat untouched on the table beside him, bread still warm from the kitchens, and Elena realized, with a small jolt, that he must have ordered it prepared for her specifically. "Good morning," he said, and something in his tone made her pause. "Good morning," she replied carefully. "I should prepare to leave. My father will be worried." "I have already sent word to your father," Cade said. "He knows you are safe." Relief washed through her, followed almost immediately by confusion, at the strange stillness in the way Cade was watching her, the careful way he chose his next words. "I have also sent word," he continued, "that the debt is settled, and that you will be remaining here at the fortress for the foreseeable future." Elena stared at him, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry?" "You are not leaving this morning, Elena," Cade said, rising slowly from his chair. "Not today, and I suspect not any time soon." The warmth she had felt toward him the night before curdled instantly into something sharper, something closer to betrayal. "That was not the arrangement," she said, her voice rising despite her effort to keep it steady. "One night. That is what the letter said. That is what you told me yourself." "I know what I said," Cade replied, and for the first time since she had met him, there was uncertainty in his voice, an unfamiliar hesitation from a man clearly unused to explaining himself. "But something happened last night that I did not expect, and I cannot in good conscience let you walk out of that gate as though nothing occurred." "Nothing occurred," Elena said sharply. "We talked, that is all. You gave me your word that nothing would happen that I did not want, and I did not want anything more than that." "I am not speaking of what happened between us in that sense," Cade said, taking a careful step closer, though he stopped when he saw her tense. "I am speaking of something deeper, something wolves are born understanding, even if we do not always recognize it right away." Elena felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the cool morning air. "What are you talking about?" Cade hesitated, clearly choosing his words with great care. "Among my kind, there is a bond between mates, one that goes beyond ordinary attraction or affection. It is instinctive, undeniable. Recognize the moment two people who are meant for each other come close enough to sense it. I have felt echoes of it before, in stories told by my elders, but I have never experienced it myself. Not until last night, sitting across from you." "That's not possible," Elena said, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. "I am human. I don't have wolf blood in me at all." "It does not require wolf blood on both sides," Cade said. "It requires only that fate has chosen you as mine, and I as yours." "I did not believe such things happened outside of legend until I felt it myself, sitting across the fire from you, listening to you speak about your mother's garden, as though nothing in the world mattered more." Elena wrapped her arms around herself, trying to process what he was telling her. "Even if that is true," she said slowly, "even if you believe it with your whole heart, that does not mean I get to lose my freedom because of something you felt. I have a life, a family. I cannot simply stay here because you tell me fate has decided it." "You misunderstand me," Cade said gently. "I am not commanding you to stay, as though you are a prisoner. I am asking you to give me the chance to prove that this bond is real, and that a life here, at my side, could be something you choose freely, rather than something forced upon you." He paused. "But I will not lie to you and pretend I have no stake in this. I cannot let you leave without trying, Elena. Not when everything in me is telling me that you are meant to be here." "You speak of choice," Elena said, anger sharpening her voice. "But you have already made the choice for me. You sent word to my father before I even woke. You never asked." Something flickered across Cade's face, and for a moment Elena thought she saw genuine regret there. "You are right," he admitted. "I acted rashly. I should have spoken with you first, before sending any word at all. That was wrong of me, and I apologize for it, sincerely." He drew a slow breath. But I am asking you now, formally, and with full respect for whatever you decide, will you give me the chance to explain myself properly, and to send new word to your father if that is what you wish, before you make any final decision? Elena studied him for a long moment, torn between anger at being told, once again, that decisions about her life would be made for her, and a strange, quiet part of herself that remembered the warmth of the previous night, the ease of their conversation, the way he had looked at her, as though she was the only person in the world worth listening to. I want to see my father, she said finally. I need to know he is truly safe, and that this is not some trick to keep me compliant. Of course, Cade said immediately. I will arrange it today. You are not a prisoner here, Elena. Whatever it may feel like this morning, you may leave the fortress grounds whenever you wish, under guard for your safety, and you may return to visit your family as often as you like. I am only asking that you not leave permanently. Not yet. Give me time to show you what I believe is true. It was not the answer Elena wanted. She wanted her old life back, the quiet garden, the simple days of tending herbs and helping her neighbors, free from the weight of pack politics and mysterious bonds she barely understood. But beneath the anger and the fear, she felt something else stirring, a curiosity she could not quite suppress, a pull toward the man standing in front of her that she did not fully trust but could not entirely deny either. I am not agreeing to anything, she said carefully. But I will stay, for now, long enough to understand what you're talking about, and long enough to see for myself that my father is safe. Something in Cade's shoulders relaxed, a tension she had not noticed until it eased. That is all I am asking, he said. As the morning wore on, servants arrived to help Elena settle into a chamber of her own, one far grander than anything she had known in her small family home. An older woman named Margaret, who had served the Ashbourne household for decades, guided her through the unfamiliar corridors with a gentleness that surprised Elena, offering small explanations of pack customs and fortress traditions without being asked. You mustn't mind the stairs, Margaret said as they walked, noting the curious glances from servants and guards alike. It isn't every day the Alpha keeps someone past a single night. Most everyone is more curious than unkind, if you give them the chance to see that for themselves. And the ones who aren't curious? Elena asked, thinking of the cold looks she had already noticed from a few passing nobles. Margaret's expression grew more careful. There are those within these walls who had other hopes for the Alpha's future, she said delicately. It would be wise to move with caution, especially in the early days. Elena filed the warning away carefully, sensing there was more to the comment than Margaret was willing to say outright, and wandered the unfamiliar halls in a daze for the remainder of the morning, trying to reconcile the fear that had brought her here with the strange new reality unfolding in front of her, unaware that her arrival had already begun sending ripples through the pack that would prove far more dangerous than she could have imagined. Because not everyone within the fortress walls was pleased to see the Alpha King's eyes soften for a human woman he had only just met. That afternoon, true to his word, Cade arranged for Elena to travel to her family's home under the escort of 2 trusted guards. The reunion with her father was everything she had hoped for and feared in equal measure. He wept openly when he saw her, pulling her into an embrace so tight it nearly stole her breath, relief and guilt warring plainly across his weathered features. I did not know he would keep you, her father said, once the first wave of emotion had passed, and they sat together at the small kitchen table, where Elena had eaten 1,000 meals throughout her childhood. Elena, if you tell me you wish to leave, I will find some way to bring you home, whatever it costs me. I don't know what I want yet, Elena admitted honestly, but I do not believe he means to harm me, father. He has been nothing but honest, even when the honesty was difficult to hear. Her father studied her carefully, searching her face for some sign of the fear he clearly expected to find there. Instead, he found something more complicated, uncertainty, mixed with a curiosity Elena herself did not fully understand yet. Your mother always said fate has a strange sense of timing, he said finally. Whatever this becomes, know that your happiness matters more to me than any debt ever could. If this man does not treat you as you deserve, you tell me, and I will find a way, whatever the cost to myself. I know, father, Elena said, squeezing his hand. I know. She returned to the fortress that evening, with a heavier heart than she had expected, torn between the familiar comfort of her old life and the strange, unsettling pull she felt toward the new one being offered to her, uncertain which direction her future was truly meant to take. The days that followed fell into an unexpected rhythm. Elena rose early each morning, long before most of the fortress stirred, and made her way to a small patch of overturned earth near the kitchen gardens that Cade had ordered prepared for her without asking, simply because she had mentioned, once, how much she missed the feel of soil beneath her fingers. She planted what seeds she could gather from the kitchen stores and the surrounding woods, and within days the first green shoots of lavender and chamomile had begun pushing up through the dark earth. It was there, kneeling in the dirt with her sleeves rolled to her elbows, that she met Priya, a young healer's apprentice who had been sent to fetch herbs for the infirmary, and instead found herself lingering to watch Elena work. "You know what you're doing," Priya said, crouching beside her with open curiosity. "Most nobles wouldn't touch dirt if their lives depended on it." "I'm not a noble," Elena said, smiling despite herself. "My mother taught me. She always said the earth doesn't care what title you carry, only whether you're willing to do the work." Priya laughed, a bright, easy sound. "I like that. Would you show me? Our head healer knows plenty about wounds and fevers, but she's never been much for growing things herself." And so began a friendship that would prove one of the steadiest comforts of Elena's new life. Mornings spent teaching Priya the difference between healing herbs and their more dangerous lookalikes. Afternoons spent laughing over small mistakes and shared cups of tea. Word spread quickly through the fortress, and within 2 weeks, Elena found herself teaching a small but growing group of the pack's younger healers, her garden expanding to accommodate the increased demand for lessons. Cade found excuses to visit more often than his duties strictly required, watching from a respectful distance as Elena laughed with her students, her hands stained green from crushed herbs, her hair coming loose from its careful braid by the end of each session. He found himself looking forward to these small glimpses of her more than he cared to admit, even to himself, and though he never lingered long enough to intrude on her lessons, Elena began to notice the pattern of his visits, the careful timing that always seemed to coincide with her afternoons in the garden. "He watches you, you know," Priya said one afternoon, not looking up from the herbs she was sorting. "Everyone's noticed." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. "He's simply checking on the garden's progress." Priya said, clearly unconvinced, a knowing smile tugging at her lips. "If you say so." It was during one such afternoon, as the 3rd week of Elena's stay drew to a close, that she encountered Serafina Blackwood for the first time. Serafina had grown up believing she would one day stand beside Cade Ashbourne as his Luna. Their families had been close for generations, their futures quietly woven together by councils of elders who saw the match as both natural and strategic. She had waited patiently through his years of grief after his mother's passing, through the long seasons he spent proving himself worthy of the throne, certain that when the time came for him to choose a mate, her name would be the only one that mattered. When word spread through the fortress that a human woman had arrived to settle her family's debt and had somehow remained afterward, Serafina dismissed it at first as nothing more than the Alpha's temporary curiosity. Humans came and went from pack business all the time. But as the days passed and Elena Whitmore was seen walking the gardens with Cade, laughing softly at something he said, receiving lessons on pack customs from the elders at his personal request, Serafina's dismissal curdled into something far colder. She found Elena on that 4th morning, standing near the edge of the herb garden, examining a row of lavender, with the careful attention of someone who genuinely loved the work. "You must be the Whitmore girl," Serafina said, her voice pleasant on the surface but carrying an edge underneath that Elena recognized immediately. Elena straightened, brushing dirt from her hands. "Elena," she said. "And you are?" "Serafina Blackwood." She let the name hang in the air as though it should mean something significant. When Elena's expression remained politely blank, something flickered with irritation behind Serafina's eyes. "I have known Cade since we were children. Our families always expected we would one day rule together." "That sounds like it would have been a fine arrangement," Elena said carefully, unsure what response was expected of her. "It still could be," Serafina said. "Whatever strange fascination has taken hold of him will pass. It always does with humans. You are a novelty, nothing more. I would advise you to enjoy the gardens while you can, and prepare yourself for the day he tires of playing house with someone who does not belong here." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced her voice to remain steady. I did not ask to be here, Lady Blackwood. If the Alpha changes his mind, I will return home without complaint. But until that day comes, I intend to be treated with the same respect as anyone else within these walls. Something like surprise crossed Seraphina's face, quickly smoothed away into practiced composure. How admirably confident, she said, for someone with no claim to anything here at all. She turned and walked away, without another word, leaving Elena standing among the lavender, with her heart hammering against her ribs. Priya, who had witnessed the exchange from a short distance, hurried over the moment Seraphina was out of earshot. Don't let her frighten you, she said. She's said worse to healers and servants alike. It's not you specifically. She's always believed the whole fortress owes her something. She's not entirely wrong to be upset, Elena said quietly. If everyone truly expected Cade to choose her, I understand why my presence would feel like an insult. Understanding doesn't mean you deserve to be treated poorly for something you never asked for, Priya said firmly. Don't let her make you feel small, Elena. You've earned your place in this garden through your own hands, whatever she thinks about titles and bloodlines. It was not long after that first uncomfortable meeting with Seraphina that Elena faced a far more serious test of her place within the fortress, one that had nothing to do with jealousy or bloodline, and everything to do with the kind of crisis that revealed a person's true worth, far more honestly than any title ever could. A young warrior named Finn, barely older than Elena herself, was carried into the fortress one evening on a makeshift stretcher, his leg torn badly during a border patrol that had gone wrong when a rock slide caught him unprepared. The pack's healers worked quickly to stop the bleeding, but by the following morning, it was clear that infection had already begun to set into the wound, and Odette, the head healer, wore an expression Elena had not seen from her before. The careful, controlled fear of someone who understood exactly how dangerous the situation had become. We have tried everything within our usual knowledge, Odette admitted to Elena that afternoon, finding her in the garden and speaking with none of the reserve she usually held toward the human woman living among them. The wound will not close properly, and the fever is climbing. I do not know what else to try. Elena followed her immediately to the infirmary, where Finn lay pale and sweating, his breathing shallow, and labored in a way that frightened her more than she let show on her face. She examined the wound carefully, drawing on every lesson her mother had ever taught her, and recognized with a jolt of memory the particular pattern of infection her mother had once treated in a farmer gored by a bull many years before. I need yarrow, if you have it, Elena said, already moving toward the shelves of dried herbs lining the infirmary walls. And honey, as much as the kitchens can spare, along with clean linen boiled in water that is cooled just enough to touch without burning. Odette hesitated only a moment before nodding, sending an apprentice running toward the kitchens while Elena began preparing the poultice her mother had taught her years before, her hands moving with a steadiness that surprised even herself given the gravity of the situation. Word spread quickly through the fortress that the human woman was attempting to treat a warrior the pack's own healers had struggled to save, and by evening, a small crowd had gathered outside the infirmary, drawn by equal parts concern and curiosity. Cade arrived among them, having heard the news during a council session, and found Elena exactly where he expected, seated beside Finn's bed, carefully reapplying the poultice she had prepared, her expression a mask of fierce concentration that reminded him, not for the first time, of exactly how much strength lived beneath her quiet, gentle manner. Will he live? Cade asked quietly, not wanting to disturb her focus. I believe so, Elena said, not looking up from her work. The fever should break by morning, if the poultice does what I expect. But he will need rest, and careful watching through the night. Then I will watch with you, Cade said simply, settling into a chair on the opposite side of the bed without further discussion. They stayed together through the long hours of that night, Elena checking Finn's fever at regular intervals, Cade quietly present beside her, offering what comfort and support he could, without interfering in work he readily admitted he did not fully understand. Just before dawn, exactly as Elena had predicted, the fever finally broke, and Finn's breathing steadied into something far closer to normal sleep than the labored gasping that had frightened everyone throughout the previous day. Odette, examining the wound the following morning, and finding it markedly improved, looked at Elena with an expression that held nothing but genuine respect. I have led this infirmary for 15 years, she said. I have never seen a poultice work so quickly against an infection that severe. Where did you learn such a thing? My mother, Elena said simply. She believed knowledge should never be hoarded, only shared as widely as possible, so that more lives could be saved by it. Then I would be grateful, Odette said, if you would consider teaching what you know, more formally, to myself and my apprentices both. I have never been too proud to admit when someone knows more than I do. Word of Finn's recovery spread quickly through the pack, and whatever lingering doubts some had held about Elena's place among them softened considerably in the days that followed. Even those who had never spoken directly to her began offering small nods of respect when she passed through the fortress halls, a shift in atmosphere that Elena noticed and treasured more than she let on, understanding, perhaps for the first time, that she had begun to earn a place here that had nothing to do with Cade's feelings toward her and everything to do with her own worth, recognized on its own merits. That evening, Elena mentioned nothing of the encounter with Serafina to Cade, unwilling to appear as though she needed him to fight her battles. But word of the exchange reached him anyway, carried by servants who had overheard the conversation from a distance, and he found her later that night in the library, curled into a large chair with one of his mother's old botany books open across her lap. You should have told me, he said, settling into the chair across from her. Told you what? Elena asked, though the slight stiffening of her shoulders gave away that she knew exactly what he meant. About Serafina, Cade said, about what she said to you this morning. Elena closed the book gently. It was nothing I could not handle myself. That is not the point, Cade said, his jaw tightening. You are a guest in my home, and more than that, you are someone I care for deeply. I will not have you insulted beneath my own roof, whether or not you feel capable of defending yourself. Elena studied him for a long moment. In the days since her arrival, she had come to know a side of him few others were permitted to see, a thoughtful, patient man, who listened more than he spoke, and who treated the responsibilities of his position as a burden to be carried carefully, rather than power to be wielded carelessly. It was becoming harder, with each passing day, to remember why she had ever feared him. She believes you were always meant to be with her, Elena said quietly. I know what she believes, Cade said. It was never something I promised her, whatever our families hoped for. I respect Serafina as a member of this pack, but I have never felt for her what I feel when I am near you. He paused, his voice softening. I know this is not the life you imagined for yourself. I know you did not choose to be caught up in pack politics or the jealousy of those who resent my attention toward you. But I meant what I said the morning after you arrived. I want the chance to earn your trust honestly, not because fate demands it, but because you decide, on your own, that this is a life worth choosing. Elena felt something in her chest loosen at his words, the same warmth she had felt that very first night by the fire returning, despite her best efforts to guard against it. I am not ready to make any decisions, she admitted, but I am not ready to leave either. Not yet. It was, she realized as she said it, the closest thing to the truth she had spoken since arriving at the fortress. Over the following weeks, Elena settled into a rhythm within the pack that surprised her with how naturally it came. Her garden lessons grew popular enough that the head healer, a stern but fair woman named Odette, formally requested Elena's assistance in restructuring the infirmary's supply of remedies, an offer that filled Elena with a pride she had not expected to feel so far from home. It was during one such afternoon, as autumn began to color the leaves along the fortress walls, that Cade finally invited Elena to see the ancient forest he had described to her that very first night. They rode out together just after sunrise, accompanied by only 2 guards who kept a respectful distance, and Elena felt her breath catch as the fortress disappeared behind them and the old wood rose up ahead, exactly as magnificent as Cade had promised. Trees taller than any building she had ever seen stretched toward a sky barely visible through their thick canopy, their trunks wide enough that it would have taken a dozen people joining hands to encircle them. A stream ran through the heart of the forest, its water so clear that Elena could see smooth stones resting on the bottom, and just as Cade had described, faint traces of glowing moss clung to the shaded banks, pulsing softly even in daylight. It's beautiful, Elena breathed, dismounting without waiting for assistance, drawn forward by the quiet magic of the place. My mother believed this forest predates the pack itself, Cade said, following behind her. That it was here long before wolves ever claimed this land, and it will remain long after all of us are gone. She used to say it made her feel small in the best possible way, reminded her that her worries, however large they seemed, were only a small part of something much older and much more enduring. Elena reached out to touch the bark of one ancient tree, feeling something like peace settle over her for the first time since the letter announcing her father's death had arrived at her family's door. "I understand what she meant," she said softly. They walked together for hours, Cade pointing out landmarks his mother had shown him as a child, Elena identifying rare plants she had only ever read about in books borrowed from the village healer. Somewhere near midday, they stopped beside the stream to share a simple meal packed by the fortress kitchens, and Elena found herself asking, gently, the question she had let rest weeks before. "Will you tell me about her now, your mother?" Cade was quiet for a long moment, watching the water move over the smooth stones. "She was kind," he said finally. "Kinder than most alpha's mates are permitted to be," some said. She believed strength and gentleness were not opposites, that a pack led with compassion was stronger than one led through fear alone. "My father loved her fiercely, and when she died, something in him died alongside her." "How did she die?" Elena asked softly. "Illness," the pack was told, Cade said, his voice carefully controlled. "That is the story that has always been shared, and it is not entirely untrue. There is more to it than that, but I am not ready to speak of it fully. Not yet." Elena nodded, respecting the boundary without pushing further, and reached over to take his hand, a small gesture of comfort that Cade accepted with visible gratitude. It was, Elena realized somewhere in the quiet stretch of afternoon, the happiest she had felt in longer than she could remember, and the realization frightened her nearly as much as it comforted her. They stopped to rest near the stream, as the sun began its slow descent, and for a long while, neither of them spoke, content simply to sit together in the dappled shade, listening to the water move over smooth stones. "Elena," Cade said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to know that I am not saying it to pressure you into anything." Elena turned to look at him, something in his tone making her heart quicken. "The mate bond does not fade," Cade said carefully. "It only grows stronger with time, for me at least. Every day you remain here, every conversation we share, every moment I watch you laughing with the healers in the garden, it becomes harder to imagine a version of my life that does not include you in it." He paused, searching her face for some sign of how his words were landing. "I am not asking you to feel the same way, not yet. But I needed you to know the truth of what is happening on my end, because I promised you honesty from the very beginning, and I intend to keep that promise, no matter how difficult the truth may be to say aloud." Elena's throat tightened with an emotion she could not quite name. She thought of her old life, the quiet garden behind her family's small home, the simple predictability of days spent tending herbs and helping neighbors who could not afford proper healers. That life felt impossibly far away now, like something belonging to a different person entirely. "I feel it too," she admitted quietly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "I have felt it growing for weeks now, and I have been trying very hard to pretend that I have not, because admitting it means admitting that everything I thought I wanted for my life might not be what I actually want at all." Cade reached out slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, and gently took her hand in his. "You do not have to have all the answers today," he said. "I only wanted you to know that whatever you decide, I will not resent you for taking the time you need." They rode back to the fortress, as the sky turned brilliant shades of orange and gold, and though neither of them spoke of it again that evening, something between them had shifted, quietly but unmistakably, into something neither of them could easily turn back from. Not everyone within the fortress shared in the warmth of that shifting bond. Seraphina Blackwood watched from a high window as Cade and Elena returned from the forest, their horses walking close together, Elena's laughter carrying faintly across the courtyard, and something cold and determined settled into her chest. She would not simply stand aside and watch her future be stolen by a human girl who had wandered into the fortress by accident of debt and desperation. If Cade would not see reason on his own, Seraphina decided, then perhaps it was time to remind him, and everyone else within the pack, exactly what kind of danger came from choosing weakness over strength, from letting sentiment guide decisions that should belong to strategy and bloodline alone. She began, that very night, to write letters to allies outside the Ashbourne territory, allies who had their own reasons to see the current Alpha weakened, and who would be more than willing to help ensure that Elena Whitmore never had the chance to become anything more than a passing curiosity in Cade Ashbourne's otherwise carefully governed life. The Pack's healers noticed nothing unusual in the weeks that followed. Elena continued her lessons in the garden, her collection of students growing steadily, as word of her knowledge spread beyond the fortress walls to neighboring villages. Cade continued his duties as Alpha, settling disputes among Pack members, meeting with envoys from neighboring territories, and finding every possible reason to end his days beside Elena, whether sharing a quiet dinner or simply sitting together in the library, while she read and he reviewed Pack correspondence. Before the council meeting concerning winter grain stores, an entirely different kind of gathering tested Elena's place within the fortress in ways she had not anticipated. An envoy arrived from the distant Fairhollow territory, a proud and cautious people who had never fully trusted the Ashbourne Pack's intentions, sent to negotiate terms for shared use of a river that ran along the border between their lands. The envoy, a sharp-eyed woman named Iris, arrived with a reputation for shrewd bargaining and very little patience for pleasantries. Cade invited Elena to sit in on the initial discussions, not out of any formal expectation that she would contribute, but simply because their evenings had become so entwined that separating them for the sake of tradition felt unnecessary to him. Iris, however, made her opinion of the arrangement clear within minutes. "I was told the Alpha of Ashbourne led with strength and clarity," Iris said coolly, glancing toward Elena with poorly concealed disapproval. "I did not expect to find him surrounded by decorative company during matters of serious negotiation." Elena felt the sting of the comment but forced herself to remain composed, understanding immediately that reacting with anger would only prove whatever assumption the envoy had already formed. Cade opened his mouth to respond sharply, but Elena placed a gentle hand on his arm, a silent request to let her answer for herself. "I am not here to negotiate on the Alpha's behalf, Envoy Iris," Elena said calmly. "I am here because I have spent recent months learning the needs of the villages along our shared border, including several that rely on that very river for both drinking water and irrigation. If my observations prove useful to your discussions, I am glad to offer them. If not, I am content simply to listen and learn." Something in Iris's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of reassessment crossing her sharp features. "And what observations might those be?" she asked, still guarded, but no longer openly dismissive. Elena spoke then of conversations she had overheard during her visits to border villages, concerns from farmers on both sides of the river about seasonal flooding that neither territory had yet addressed formally, concerns that, if left unresolved, would likely cause far more lasting damage than any dispute over water rights currently being negotiated. Iris listened with growing interest, occasionally asking pointed questions that Elena answered honestly, admitting freely when she did not know enough to speak with certainty. By the end of the evening, Iris had softened considerably, and as she prepared to retire for the night, she paused beside Elena, with an expression far different from the one she had worn upon arrival. "I have negotiated with a great many Packs in my years serving Fairhollow," she said. "Few Alphas surround themselves with advisors willing to admit the limits of their own knowledge so plainly. It speaks well of your judgment, human woman, whatever your place within this Pack may formally be." "Thank you," Elena said, genuinely touched by the grudging respect in the envoy's tone. "I hope our territories can find a solution that serves both our people fairly." The negotiations that followed, informed in part by the concerns Elena had raised, concluded within days, in an agreement that satisfied both territories more thoroughly than either side had initially expected, and Cade found himself, once again, deeply grateful for a partner whose insight extended far beyond the garden where she had first proven her worth. "You handled her far better than I would have managed alone," Cade admitted that night, as they walked together along the fortress walls beneath a sky scattered with stars. "I nearly lost my temper when she spoke of you so dismissively." "I noticed," Elena said, smiling, "but anger rarely changes anyone's mind, whereas patience sometimes does. My mother taught me that too, among everything else." "Your mother," Cade said, shaking his head with quiet amazement, "seems to have taught you everything worth knowing." "Not everything," Elena said softly, leaning against him as they walked. "Some things I am learning entirely on my own, here, with you." It was not long after the successful negotiations with Fairhollow that the formal council was called to discuss the coming winter's grain stores, and Elena, invited by Cade to observe the proceedings, found herself seated at the edge of a long table, surrounded by pack elders, whose expressions ranged from curious to openly skeptical of her presence. Among them sat an elder named Bramwell, gruff and set in his ways, who made little effort to hide his disapproval. "With respect, Alpha," Bramwell said partway through the meeting, his eyes flicking toward Elena. "Some matters of pack governance are perhaps not suited for outside ears, however charming the company." The table fell silent, and Elena felt her cheeks warm, though she forced herself to remain composed, rather than shrink beneath the weight of the elder's scrutiny. "Elena is not outside this pack, Bramwell," Cade said evenly, though there was steel beneath the calm of his voice. "She has spent weeks teaching our healers skills that have already saved lives in the infirmary. If you believe her presence here diminishes this council, I would ask you to reconsider what truly strengthens a pack, knowledge and compassion, or simple bloodline alone." Bramwell said nothing further, though his gaze remained cool for the remainder of the meeting. Afterward, as the elders filed out, Elena touched Cade's arm gently. "You did not need to defend me so forcefully," she said. "I do not wish to become a source of division among your council." "You are not the source of division," Cade replied. "Fear of change is. I would rather face that fear honestly than pretend it does not exist simply to keep the peace." He studied her carefully. "Does Bramwell's disapproval trouble you?" "A little," Elena admitted, "but less than I expected. I find I care more about what you think of me than what any council member believes." It was during one such evening, as autumn deepened into the first chill of coming winter, that Elena finally traveled home to see her father again, this time carrying with her a satchel of preserved herbs and simple remedies she had prepared herself, gifts for the village healer who had once lent her books she could not afford to buy. Her father wept when he saw her, pulling her into an embrace so tight it nearly stole her breath, and Elena felt tears of her own slip free as she took in how much healthier he looked. The worry lines that had etched themselves into his face over months of mounting debt, now softened by relief and gratitude. "You look well," he said, holding her at arm's length to study her properly. "Better than well. You look happy, Elena." "I am," she admitted, surprised by how easily the words came. "It is not the life I imagined for myself, but it has become something I did not know I needed." Her father's gaze moved past her to where Cade stood near the door, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to ensure her safety. "He has treated you well?" her father asked quietly. "Better than well," Elena said. "He has treated me like someone whose choices matter, which is more than I expected when I first arrived at his gates." Her father nodded slowly, something like understanding passing across his weathered face. "Your mother would have liked him," he said finally. "She always said the measure of a person was found, not in how they treated those with power to reward them, but in how they treated those with none. From what I have heard, the Alpha King has treated you exactly as she would have hoped." They stayed through the evening, sharing a simple meal at the small table, where Elena had eaten countless meals throughout her childhood, and as the night grew late, she felt a strange, bittersweet ache settle into her chest, the recognition that this small home, once the entirety of her world, had somehow become only a part of a much larger life she was still learning to understand. As they rode back toward the fortress beneath a sky thick with stars, Cade reached over and took her hand, and this time, Elena did not hesitate before lacing her fingers through his. "Thank you," she said softly, "for bringing me home tonight, and for bringing me back to yours." Cade glanced at her, something warm and unguarded crossing his features in the moonlight. "There is nowhere else I would rather be," he said, "than wherever you are." Neither of them noticed the rider who had followed at a careful distance through the trees, watching their exchange with cold, calculating eyes, before turning back toward the fortress to deliver a report to Seraphina Blackwood, who had been waiting, quite patiently, for exactly the kind of information that would finally set her carefully laid plans into motion. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the fortress grounds in a thick layer of snow that transformed the courtyard into something out of one of the old stories Elena's mother used to tell her as a child. Elena found herself standing at her window most mornings, watching the pack's younger members chase each other across the white ground, their laughter carrying up through the cold air, and she felt, more and more with each passing day, that this strange new life had somehow become simply her life, without her ever quite noticing the moment the transformation occurred. Cade had grown quieter in recent weeks, and though Elena noticed the change, she assumed at first it was simply the weight of winter duties settling over him, the added responsibility of ensuring the pack's stores were sufficient to last through the coldest months. It was only when she found him one evening, sitting alone in his study, staring into a fire that had burned nearly to embers, that she realized something deeper was troubling him. "You've been distant," she said gently, settling into the chair across from him, without waiting for an invitation, a familiarity that had grown naturally between them over the months. Cade looked up, and for a moment she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression before he carefully smoothed it away. "It is nothing you need concern yourself with," he said. "That has never stopped me from concerning myself before," Elena replied, and was rewarded with the faint ghost of a smile. He was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight she had not heard from him before. "My mother did not die of illness, as most within the pack believe," he said. "She was poisoned by someone within our own walls who believed her too soft to lead a pack through difficult times, someone who thought my father would be a stronger alpha without her influence softening his decisions." Elena's breath caught. "Cade, I am so sorry." "I was young when it happened, barely old enough to understand what had been taken from me," he continued. "But I remember, very clearly, my father's grief afterward, how he closed himself off from everyone, myself included, convinced that allowing himself to love anyone that deeply again would only invite more tragedy into our lives. He ruled the remainder of his years as alpha, through duty alone, never warmth, and I promised myself I would learn from his example, that I would never allow myself to become so attached to another person that their loss could break me the way it broke him. And yet," Elena said softly, understanding beginning to dawn, "here we are." "Here we are," Cade agreed, meeting her eyes directly. "I did not choose this bond, Elena. I fought against acknowledging it for longer than I have admitted to you, because some part of me feared that loving you as deeply as I already do would only be inviting the same tragedy that destroyed my father. But I have come to understand something these past months, watching you teach the pack's children in your garden, listening to you laugh with healers who once feared to even look me in the eye. I would rather risk that pain, whatever it may eventually cost me, than spend my life the way my father did, closed off and alone, simply because loving someone made him vulnerable." Elena crossed the space between them and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers the way he had once taken hers beside the stream in the ancient forest. "I am not going anywhere," she said quietly. "Not because fate has decided it for either of us, but because I choose it. I choose this. I choose you." Something shifted in the air between them then, a recognition that went beyond simple words, and when Cade finally leaned forward to close the remaining distance between them, Elena met him without hesitation, without the fear that had once kept her guarded against exactly this kind of certainty. The kiss was gentle at first, careful, as though he were still giving her every opportunity to change her mind. But when she did not pull away, when instead she leaned further into him, something deeper passed between them, a recognition that settled into her very bones. The bond, when it finally solidified fully between them that night, was unlike anything either of them had experienced. Elena felt it as a warmth spreading outward from her chest, a sense of rightness so profound it nearly brought her to tears, and Cade felt it as a kind of completion he had not known he was missing until the exact moment it arrived. Neither needed to say anything more. The truth had already made itself known in a language older than words. News of the confirmed mate bond spread through the fortress within days, carried by servants who had witnessed the unmistakable change in how the alpha carried himself, a lightness that had not been present since before his mother's death. Most of the pack received the news with genuine warmth, having grown fond of Elena over the months she had spent among them, teaching their children, healing their wounds, and treating every member of the pack, regardless of standing, with the same quiet respect. Even Bramwell, watching Elena organize a winter festival for the pack's youngest members a few days later, was heard to admit, grudgingly, that perhaps the alpha had chosen more wisely than he first assumed. Seraphina Blackwood received the news very differently. She had spent the winter months carefully cultivating relationships with pack leaders from the neighboring Thornwood territory, wolves who had long resented the Ashbourne pack's dominance over the region's most valuable hunting grounds, and who saw, in Serafina's carefully worded letters, an opportunity to weaken their rivals from within. She had painted a careful picture for them, one where the Alpha King had grown weak and distracted, blinded by sentiment for a human woman with no claim to power or bloodline, and where the pack itself stood vulnerable to any leader bold enough to seize the opportunity, while their ruler's attention remained divided. Her primary contact within Thornwood was a wolf named Doran, second in command to that territory's own leader, a man whose ambition ran deeper than his loyalty. Doran had responded to Serafina's letters with growing interest, recognizing in her bitterness a useful tool for destabilizing a rival pack without risking open war. "You understand," Doran had written in his most recent letter, "that once we act, there can be no undoing it. The girl will need to disappear cleanly, and the Alpha will need to believe, at least for a time, that concessions are his only path to her safe return." Serafina had read the letter twice before burning it in her private hearth, a flicker of doubt crossing her mind before hardening once more into resolve. She told herself this was necessary, that the pack's future depended on removing a threat that Cade himself was too blinded by sentiment to recognize. She told herself many things in the days that followed, each one a brick added to the wall she built around whatever conscience remained. When news arrived that the bond between Cade and Elena had been formally confirmed, Serafina understood that her window for action had narrowed considerably. A confirmed mate bond was not easily broken, and once word spread that Elena carried the full protection and devotion of the Alpha King, any attempt to remove her would carry consequences far beyond what Serafina had originally anticipated. She sent word to Doran that very night. It was time, she wrote, to act, before the human girl's position within the pack grew any more secure than it already had. 3 nights later, as the first heavy snow of the season fell silently over the fortress grounds, Elena woke to the sound of her bedroom door opening, and before she could fully process what was happening, a rough hand clamped over her mouth, silencing the scream that rose instinctively in her throat. She was pulled from her bed and bound before she could gather her thoughts enough to fight back properly, dragged through servant passages she had never known existed, passages clearly designed for exactly this kind of covert movement through the fortress. By the time her mind cleared enough to attempt real resistance, she found herself being loaded onto a horse in the courtyard, her wrists bound tightly enough to bruise, a cloth gag preventing her from calling out for help. The last thing she saw before the horse carried her away from the fortress was a familiar figure watching from a shadowed archway, arms crossed, expression carefully composed into something almost satisfied. Serafina. Elena's heart pounded with fear and fury in equal measure as the horse carried her deeper into the surrounding forest, away from every bit of safety and warmth she had come to know over the past months. She thought of Cade, asleep in the room beside hers, unaware yet of what had happened, and she prayed, with every fiber of her being, that he would wake soon enough to notice her absence, before whatever plan had been set into motion could be completed. Cade woke just before dawn, reaching instinctively across the space between their chambers, and the moment he registered the absence of Elena's presence, both physically and through the bond that connected them, a cold, sharp panic seized his chest, unlike anything he had experienced since the night his mother died. He was on his feet and moving before conscious thought fully caught up with instinct, throwing open the door to Elena's chamber to find it empty, the bedding disturbed in a manner that spoke unmistakably of struggle. A single strand of dark hair caught against the doorframe, and beneath the window, faint tracks in a light dusting of snow that had fallen through the open pane. Someone had taken her. Cade's roar of fury echoed through the fortress halls, waking every wolf within earshot, and within minutes, the entire pack had assembled in the courtyard, ready to move at their alpha's command. Cade forced himself to breathe, to think clearly, despite the desperate pull of the bond urging him to simply run blindly into the forest and search until he found her, no matter how long it took or what dangers he might face along the way. "Track the trail from her window," he ordered, his voice carrying an authority sharpened by barely controlled rage. "I want to know exactly which direction they took her, and I want to know within the hour." It was one of the younger trackers, a wolf named Callum, who had grown close to Elena during her lessons in the garden, who first noticed the pattern in the servant passages that had been used to remove her from the fortress undetected. "These passages are not widely known, Alpha," Callum reported, his expression grim. Only a handful of people within the fortress would have this kind of knowledge. Servants who have worked here for generations, and nobility who grew up exploring these halls as children. Cade's blood ran cold as understanding settled over him. There was only one person within the fortress who fit that description, and who had shown, repeatedly, hostility toward Elena's presence among them. Serafina, he said, the name coming out as something closer to a growl than a word. A thorough search of Serafina Blackwood's chambers revealed exactly what Cade had feared. Letters carefully preserved despite her apparent attempts at discretion. Correspondence with Thornwood leaders, detailing plans that had been unfolding for months, long before the mate bond had even been confirmed. Cade read through them with mounting horror and fury, understanding at last the full scope of the danger Elena now faced, taken not simply out of jealousy, but as a calculated move in a much larger scheme to weaken his rule and destabilize the pack itself. Serafina herself was nowhere to be found within the fortress, having clearly fled the moment her plan was set into motion, and Cade knew, with grim certainty, that whatever she had arranged for Elena, time was now the most precious resource he had left. Assemble the strongest trackers and fighters within the pack, he ordered. We move at first light, following whatever trail we can find toward Thornwood territory. And someone find me the fastest route through the old forest. If they are moving her through packlands, that is the most likely path they will take to avoid detection. Bramwell, of all people, was among the first to step forward, his earlier skepticism entirely forgotten in the face of the crisis. I will ride with you, Alpha, he said gruffly. Whatever doubts I once held about the girl, no one deserves what has been done to her tonight. As dawn broke fully over the fortress, painting the snow in shades of pale gold, Cade Ashbourne rode out at the head of the largest search party the pack had assembled in a generation, driven by a fear and determination that burned hotter than anything he had felt in all his years as Alpha. Somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of forest and territory beyond his direct control, the woman who had become the very center of his world was being carried further away with each passing hour, and he intended to move heaven and earth itself to bring her home safely. Elena had lost track of how long she had been riding by the time the horse finally slowed, her body aching from the awkward position she had been forced to maintain, her wrists raw beneath the rope binding them. The forest around her had grown unfamiliar somewhere in the passing hours, the trees taller and more tangled than anything within Ashbourne territory, and when she was finally pulled from the horse and the gag removed from her mouth, she found herself standing in a small clearing, surrounded by wolves she did not recognize, their eyes cold and assessing in the pale morning light. You'll find no one here interested in hearing you scream, said a voice from behind her, and Elena turned to find Serafina standing near the edge of the clearing, wrapped in a thick fur cloak, looking entirely too satisfied with herself for Elena's liking. I should have known, Elena said, forcing steadiness into her voice, despite the fear tightening her chest. You could not simply accept that Cade chose me. Cade did not choose you, Serafina said sharply. Fate played a cruel trick on all of us, tying him to someone with no understanding of pack legacy, no bloodline worth honoring, nothing to offer beyond whatever fleeting comfort you provide him in the privacy of his chambers. I am simply correcting an error before it can do lasting damage to this entire region. And what exactly do you plan to do with me? Elena asked, lifting her chin, despite the tremor she could not quite suppress from her voice. Serafina's smile was cold and entirely without warmth. That depends a great deal on how quickly your Alpha King comes looking for you, and how willing he is to make certain concessions once he arrives. Elena's stomach dropped as understanding settled over her. This was not simply about removing her from Cade's life. This was leverage, a calculated move meant to force concessions from him, concessions that would almost certainly weaken the pack he had spent his entire life protecting. He won't bend to threats, Elena said, though she was not entirely certain the words were true. You clearly don't know him as well as you believe you do. We shall see, Serafina said, turning away with an air of dismissal. Make her comfortable, she instructed the wolves, standing guard. We may be waiting some time, and I have no interest in explaining bruises to the Alpha King when he finally arrives to collect what remains of his precious mate. Elena was led to a small tent at the edge of the clearing, her hands finally freed once it became clear she had nowhere to run within the heavily guarded camp, and left alone, with only her thoughts, and the growing certainty that she needed to find some way to help herself, rather than simply waiting for rescue. She spent the following hours carefully observing the patterns of the guards stationed outside her tent, noting when shifts changed, which wolves seemed most attentive to their duties, and which grew careless as the day wore on. Her mother had always told her that even the smallest knowledge could become a powerful tool in the right circumstances, and Elena intended to use every bit of observation available to her. By the time evening fell over the camp, she had noticed something the guards themselves seemed unaware of. A particular herb growing wild at the edge of the clearing, one her mother had taught her long ago could cause a deep, heavy drowsiness when brewed correctly, mild enough to seem like simple exhaustion rather than deliberate sabotage. When one of the younger guards, a nervous wolf named Ellis, who seemed distinctly uncomfortable with his assigned duty, brought her a small portion of food and water that evening, Elena forced herself to remain calm, thanking him politely and asking, in a voice carefully pitched to sound merely curious rather than calculating, whether it might be possible to have something warm to drink given the cold. "I don't see why not," Ellis muttered, glancing around as though checking that no one else was listening. "For what it's worth, I don't much like this business. Serafina promised us glory, fighting alongside Thornwood, not kidnapping innocent women in the middle of the night." "Then help me," Elena said quietly, seizing the opening. "Not by freeing me outright. I would never ask you to risk that. But bring me that tea, and look the other way if you notice anything unusual about how the guards behave later tonight." Ellis studied her for a long moment, clearly wrestling with conflicting loyalties, before giving a small, almost imperceptible nod and hurrying off toward the fire at the camp's center. It took considerable effort, once he returned with a simple cup and confirmed a portion of it had been used to brew tea for the wider camp as well, to slip the crushed herb she had gathered earlier into the larger pot the guards themselves used, working under the cover of darkness, while pretending to simply stretch her legs near the tent's entrance. It was not a perfect plan, and she knew it might not work at all, but it was the only tool available to her, and she intended to use it. Meanwhile, Cade and his search party had been tracking Elena's trail throughout the day, with a single-minded determination that left even his most seasoned trackers struggling to match his pace. By nightfall, they had crossed well into Thornwood territory, and Callum, riding close beside his Alpha, finally spotted the telltale signs of a large camp nestled within a clearing not far ahead. "There, Alpha," Callum said quietly, pointing toward a faint glow of firelight visible through the trees. "That has to be them." Cade's wolf surged forward beneath his skin, every instinct screaming at him to charge into that clearing and tear apart anyone who stood between himself and Elena. He forced himself to breathe, to think with the clarity his position demanded, rather than the desperate fury clawing at his chest. "We approach quietly," he said, his voice low but carrying absolute authority. "I want eyes on the camp's full layout before we make any move. Elena's safety comes before anything else, including the satisfaction of tearing Serafina apart with my bare hands." The search party spread out silently through the trees, and it was Callum who first noticed something unusual unfolding within the camp itself. Several of the guards stumbling as though heavily intoxicated, their movements sluggish and uncoordinated in a manner entirely inconsistent with simple exhaustion. "Something is wrong with them," Callum reported back quietly. "They're barely able to stand straight." Cade felt a flicker of something, almost like pride, cut through his fear, a suspicion forming about exactly what Elena might have done to weaken her captor's defenses. It was, he thought grimly, exactly the kind of resourceful action he had come to expect from her. "Now," Cade ordered, and the pack moved as one, converging on the compromised camp with speed and precision that left the already weakened guards no real chance to mount an effective defense. Elena heard the commotion from within her tent, shouts, and the sound of scuffling breaking the previously quiet night, and her heart leapt with hope, even as fear kept her frozen in place, uncertain whether the chaos outside signaled rescue or further danger. It was only when the tent flap was thrown open, and she saw Cade standing there, eyes wild with a mixture of fury and desperate relief, that she allowed herself to believe rescue had truly arrived. "Cade," she breathed, and then she was in his arms, pulled tight against his chest, as he ran his hands over her, checking for injuries with barely restrained urgency. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he made no effort to hide. "I'm all right," Elena said, though her voice trembled with the release of hours of carefully maintained composure. "I'm all right, Cade. You found me. I will always find you, he said fiercely, pressing his forehead against hers. No matter how far, no matter how long it takes, I will always find you. Outside the tent, the battle for control of the camp continued, though with the guards weakened by Elena's carefully executed plan. It was quickly becoming clear that the Ashbourne pack held a decisive advantage. Serafina, realizing the situation had turned entirely against her, attempted to flee into the surrounding forest, only to find her path blocked by Bramwell himself, his expression leaving no doubt as to how he viewed her betrayal. You disappoint me more than I have words to express, Bramwell said coldly, gripping her arm firmly enough to prevent escape. I doubted the human girl's place among us, but I never once doubted your loyalty to this pack. It seems I was wrong on both counts. She was brought before Cade within the hour, her wrists bound in a bitter mirror of how Elena had been treated only a day before, her expression a mixture of defiance and barely concealed fear as she faced the full weight of the Alpha's fury. You conspired with our rivals to weaken this pack, Cade said, his voice deadly quiet in a way that carried far more authority than any shout could have managed. You endangered the woman I love, out of nothing more than wounded pride and misplaced entitlement to a position you were never owed. I did what I believed was necessary to protect this pack's future, Serafina said, though the conviction in her voice had noticeably weakened. You were blinding yourself to what truly matters for the sake of sentiment. What truly matters, Cade said, is loyalty, honor. The willingness to protect this pack without resorting to betrayal and conspiracy with those who wish us harm. You have shown me tonight that you possess none of these qualities, whatever illusions you once held about your place at my side. He turned to address the wolves who had assisted in Elena's rescue, his voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Serafina Blackwood is stripped of all standing within this pack, effective immediately. She will be escorted from Ashbourne territory and forbidden from returning under penalty of formal exile enforcement. Any further conspiracy with Thornwood, or any other rival territory, will be treated as an act of war against this pack, and will be answered accordingly. The finality in his voice left no room for argument, and as Serafina was led away under guard, her carefully constructed plans in complete ruin around her, Elena felt the last of the tension that had gripped her throughout the ordeal finally begin to release. Take me home, she whispered against Cade's chest, and he did not need to ask which home she meant. The journey back to the fortress passed in a blur for Elena, exhaustion finally catching up with her once the immediate danger had faded, and she slept for much of the ride, safely cradled in front of Cade on his horse, his arms holding her secure against the cold night air. When she woke, the familiar walls of the Ashbourne fortress were rising ahead of them in the pale light of early morning, and something in her chest loosened at the sight, a recognition that this place, once so foreign and frightening, had truly become the home she had never expected to find. The pack greeted their return with visible relief, servants and warriors alike gathering in the courtyard despite the early hour, their expressions softening with genuine warmth as Elena was helped down from the horse, clearly unharmed despite her ordeal. Word had already spread of how she had outwitted her captors through her own resourcefulness, and the respect in the eyes of those who had once viewed her as nothing more than a passing curiosity had transformed into something far deeper. Cade insisted she rest through the following days, though Elena found herself growing restless within hours, unaccustomed to being treated as though she were fragile after everything she had endured. Priya visited often during that time, bringing small updates from the garden and the infirmary, careful never to overstay her welcome, but clearly relieved to see her friend safe and recovering. You should have seen Callum, Priya said one afternoon, settling into the chair beside Elena's bed. He hasn't stopped talking about how quickly you noticed those herbs in the clearing. I think half the younger trackers want you to teach a class on wilderness survival now, in addition to healing. Elena laughed, despite the lingering ache in her wrists. I would rather never see that particular herb again in my life, honestly. But I am glad it proved useful. It was Bramwell himself who finally relented, understanding that her spirit needed the freedom to move and act, rather than remain confined to a bed, however comfortable it might be, arriving unannounced one morning to formally apologize for his earlier doubts about her place within the pack. I judged you before I knew you, he said gruffly, clearly uncomfortable with the admission. I have led long enough to know that pride and stubbornness make poor advisors. You have shown more courage and resourcefulness than most warriors I have trained in my years serving this pack. I was wrong to doubt you, and I am sorry for it. Thank you, Bramwell, Elena said, touched by the sincerity behind the gruff words. I understand why my presence here seems strange at first. I hope, in time, I can prove worthy of the trust you're offering now. You already have, Bramwell said simply, and left without further ceremony, though something had clearly shifted in how he regarded her from that day forward. You handled yourself with remarkable courage, Cade told her one evening, as they sat together in the library, where their bond had first begun to deepen months before. I have led warriors far stronger than most, who would not have kept their composure the way you did. I was terrified, Elena admitted, but I remembered something my mother always told me. Fear does not have to control your actions, even when it controls your feelings. Your mother sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Cade said softly. She would have liked you, Elena said, echoing the words her father had spoken months before. She always said the truest measure of strength was found in patience and kindness, not in cruelty or dominance. I think she would have seen exactly that in you, the same things I have come to see myself. Cade reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, with the same easy familiarity that had grown between them over the months. I have something to ask you, he said, and something in his tone made Elena's heart quicken. Not because fate has decided it, and not because of any debt or arrangement made before either of us understood what we would come to mean to each other. I am asking because it is what I want, more than anything I have ever wanted in my entire life. He rose and knelt before her chair, much as he had that very first morning, when he told her he would not let her leave the fortress, though the fear that had gripped her then was entirely absent now, replaced instead by a warmth so complete it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Elena Whitmore, he said, his voice steady, despite the vulnerability plain in his expression. Will you stand beside me, as Luna of this pack, not because of any debt owed, not because fate demanded it of either of us, but because you choose it freely, exactly as I am choosing you? Elena felt tears slip free even as a smile broke across her face, wider and more genuine than any she had allowed herself in longer than she could remember. Yes, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Yes, Cade. I choose this. I choose you. I have been choosing you every single day since that very first night by the fire, even when I was too afraid to admit it to myself. The weeks that followed passed in a flurry of preparation, unlike anything Elena had ever experienced. Margaret took charge of the ceremonial arrangements, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had waited a very long time for a joyful occasion to plan, while Priya and several of the younger healers busied themselves gathering the earliest blossoms of spring for the celebration, determined that Elena's own garden would provide the flowers for her ceremony. Elena traveled home once more before the wedding, this time to formally invite her father and to ask, with a request that clearly moved him beyond words, whether he would walk her through the ceremony himself. I would be honored, her father said, his voice thick with emotion, though I never imagined, when that letter arrived at our door all those months ago, that it would lead to something so wonderful. Neither did I, Elena admitted, smiling. Sometimes the hardest beginnings lead us somewhere we never expected to find. The ceremony itself, held as the last of winter's snow began melting into the first tentative signs of spring, was unlike anything the pack had witnessed in generations. Elena stood before the assembled pack in a gown the color of new leaves, her hair woven with early spring flowers gathered from the garden she had cultivated with her own hands, and when Cade took her hand before the pack elders to formally bind their union, the mate bond that had first sparked between them by an ordinary fireside blazed into something that even those without wolf blood in the crowd could feel, a warmth that seemed to touch every corner of the courtyard. Her father stood in the front row, tears streaming freely down his weathered face, no longer burdened by guilt over the debt that had first brought his daughter to this fortress, but overwhelmed instead with joy at seeing her stand exactly where she was always meant to be, not as payment for a debt, but as a woman who had found, through courage and patience and an open heart, a life and a love entirely of her own choosing. Beside him, Priya wept openly as well, clutching Callum's arm for support, while even Bramwell, standing stiffly near the elders, was seen to wipe discreetly at his eyes. As the ceremony concluded and the pack erupted into celebration around them, Cade pulled Elena close, resting his forehead against hers, exactly as he had that terrifying night in the Thornwood camp, though this time, the emotion between them carried nothing but joy. "One night," he murmured softly, "was never going to be enough for someone like you." Elena laughed, the sound bright and full against the warm spring air. "Good thing you refused to let me leave then," she said. "Best decision I ever made," Cade replied, and as he lowered his lips to hers before the entire gathered pack, Elena understood, with a certainty that settled deep into her very bones, that whatever had brought her to these gates all those months ago, whatever fear and uncertainty had marked that first cold night, none of it mattered anymore, beside the simple, unshakable truth of the life they had built together, chosen freely, and destined to last for all the years still waiting ahead of them. The garden she had planted that first autumn continued to grow long after the ceremony ended, tended now not only by Elena, but by the pack's youngest members, who had come to love the quiet lessons offered beneath the herb beds each afternoon. Priya, in time, was formally named head healer of the Ashbourne pack, a position she often credited to the patient teaching Elena had offered from that very first day in the garden. The ancient forest remained exactly as magical as it had been the day Cade first showed it to her, and they returned often through the years, walking hand in hand beside the glowing moss and the clear stream, always finding, in that quiet sanctuary, the same peace that had first drawn them together. Seraphina Blackwood was never seen within Ashbourne territory again, her ambitions permanently extinguished by the consequences of her own choices, while the alliance between the Ashbourne and Thornwood territories, rather than weakening as she had hoped, grew stronger in the years that followed, built on the foundation of a peace that Cade and Elena worked tirelessly, together, to maintain, a peace that even Doran himself, once Seraphina's willing conspirator, eventually came to respect and support. And though the story of how they came together began with a debt and a single night, meant to end at sunrise, it became known throughout the region, in the years that followed, as something far greater than a simple transaction ever could have been. It became a story about choice, about courage found in the quietest moments, and about a bond that, once truly recognized, refused to be defined by anything as small as the circumstances that first brought two hearts together. Spring gave way to a season of quiet rebuilding, though not every wound left by Seraphina's betrayal healed as quickly as the frost melted from the fortress grounds. Doran, once so willing to conspire against a rival pack for the sake of ambition, found himself summoned before his own territory's leader within weeks of the failed plot, forced to answer for actions that had nearly dragged two packs into open war. His punishment was severe, though not final, and it was Cade himself, surprisingly, who intervened on his behalf when word reached the fortress of the harsh judgment being considered. "Let him live with the consequences of his choices," Cade said during a formal exchange of envoys that spring, "but do not destroy a man who can still be taught better. I have learned this year that people are not always beyond changing, if given the right reason to try." It was a mercy Doran had not expected, and one that haunted him more than any punishment could have. He spent the following months working quietly to repair the damage his ambition had nearly caused, eventually becoming, against every expectation, one of the strongest advocates for lasting peace between Thornwood and Ashbourne territory, a transformation that Elena, upon hearing of it, found strangely moving. "Do you think people truly change?" she asked Cade one evening, as they walked together through the newly blooming garden, the scent of lavender thick in the warm air. "I think most people are capable of it," Cade said thoughtfully, "if someone is willing to give them a reason beyond simple punishment. My father never believed that. He thought strength meant crushing anyone who threatened the pack completely, without mercy. I have come to believe differently, largely because of you." "Because of me?" Elena asked, surprised. "You showed mercy to a frightened guard in a Thornwood camp when you had every reason to think only of your own escape," Cade said. "You taught our healers without ever asking what advantage it might bring you. You have shown me, again and again, that strength and kindness are not opposites, exactly as my mother always believed. I only needed someone to remind me." Elena leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder as they walked. "Your mother would be proud of the man you've become," she said softly. "I hope so," Cade said. "I think of her often, especially now. I wish she could have known you." Their first summer together as bonded mates passed in a haze of small, ordinary joys, that Elena had never imagined she would come to treasure so deeply. She expanded the garden further, adding a section devoted entirely to teaching children the basics of plant care, and found herself, more days than not, surrounded by a small crowd of pack pups, eager to help her water seedlings, or identify which leaves were safe to touch, and which were not. Ellis, the young guard who had quietly helped her during her captivity, was formally commended by Cade before the full council, an honor that left the young wolf red-faced with embarrassment but visibly proud. He went on, in the following years, to become one of the most trusted members of the Fortress Guard, often assigned personally to accompany Elena on her travels beyond Packlands, a duty he carried out with a quiet devotion that spoke to how deeply her small act of trust in that clearing had changed the course of his life. Priya's position as head healer brought its own challenges that summer, as an outbreak of fever swept through several of the villages under Ashbourne protection. Elena worked alongside her for weeks without rest, drawing on every remedy her mother had ever taught her, and it was during this crisis that the pack came to understand, fully and completely, exactly how much value the Alpha's chosen mate brought to their lives beyond the simple fact of her bond with their leader. "You saved my daughter's life," one villager told her tearfully, pressing a small carved wooden bird into Elena's hands as a token of gratitude she had no other way to offer. "Whatever they say about outsiders not belonging among us, you belong here more than most who were born to it." Elena kept that small wooden bird on the windowsill of her chamber for the rest of her life, a reminder, on difficult days, of exactly why the strange and frightening journey that began with a debt-ridden letter had led her somewhere she never regretted arriving. Bramwell, in the years that followed, became something unexpected to Elena, not merely an elder who had grudgingly accepted her place among the pack, but something closer to a stern, protective friend. He taught her, at her own request, the basics of self-defense that every pack member learned from childhood, unwilling, as he put it gruffly, to let the Luna of this pack ever again find herself with nothing but a garden herb standing between herself and danger. "You could have simply told me no," Elena teased him, during one particularly grueling early lesson, breathless and sore from an afternoon of training. "I could have," Bramwell agreed, not unkindly. "But I have grown fond of having you underfoot, Luna. Whatever reluctance I first held about your arrival, I would rather see you prepared than sorry." The years that followed brought their own share of challenges, as any life built on real responsibility inevitably does. Disputes arose between villages that required careful mediation. Harsh winters tested the pack's stores and patience alike, and twice more rival territories attempted, with far less subtlety than Serafina had once employed, to test the strength of Cade's rule. Each time, the pack met these challenges together, stronger for the trust that had been built in those first difficult months, and each time, Elena stood beside Cade, not as a burden to be protected from the world, but as a true partner in facing whatever came. When their first child was born, a daughter with her father's storm-colored eyes and her mother's gentle patience, the entire pack gathered in the courtyard to celebrate, and Elena, exhausted and radiant, looked out over the crowd of faces that had once regarded her with suspicion, and now looked back at her with nothing but warmth and welcome. "She'll grow up surrounded by people who love her," Cade murmured, watching Elena hold their daughter for the first time. "Exactly as it should be." "Exactly as we built it," Elena corrected gently. "Together." They named her after Cade's mother, a small but meaningful gesture that brought tears to the eyes of the eldest pack members, who still remembered the woman who had once believed, long before anyone else did, that strength and kindness could walk hand in hand within these very walls. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to ask about how her parents had first met, Elena would tell the story carefully, choosing her words with the same thoughtfulness she once brought to identifying herbs in her mother's garden. Careful to include not only the fear of that first frightening night, but the courage it had taken to stay, the patience it had taken to build trust, and the choice, made freely by both of them, that had turned an arrangement born of debt into a bond neither of them would ever have traded for anything else in the world. "Your father refused to let me leave that morning," Elena would say, smiling at the memory that had once frightened her so completely, "and it turned out to be the greatest gift anyone had ever given me, though it took me quite some time to understand that. Was he right to keep you?" Her daughter would ask, wide-eyed with the particular seriousness only children bring to matters of fairness. "He was right to ask," Elena would answer carefully. "And I was right to choose to stay. Once I understood I truly had a choice in the matter. That is the part that mattered most, in the end. Not that he kept me, but that I chose him, freely, with my whole heart, once I knew the truth of who he was. Spring gave way to summer, and with it came the first true test of Elena's new role as Luna, one that had nothing to do with danger or conspiracy, and everything to do with the quiet, grinding work of leadership itself. A dispute arose between two families at the edge of Ashbourne territory over water rights to a shared stream, a disagreement that had simmered for years and threatened, that summer, to boil over into something uglier. Cade would ordinarily have settled it himself, but he asked Elena to sit beside him during the hearing, not as a formality, but because he valued her instincts about people in ways he had come to trust completely. The two families stood before them in the great hall, voices raised, old grievances spilling out in tangled, bitter detail. Elena listened for a long while without speaking, watching the way each side flinched at certain accusations and grew calm at others, until she finally raised a hand, gently, for silence. "You are not truly fighting over water," she said. "You are fighting over an insult neither side has ever apologized for. The water is simply where the anger found a place to live." She looked between the two families. "Am I wrong?" The silence that followed told her she was not, and slowly, carefully, old wounds, that had nothing to do with streams or land, began to surface. Wounds that could finally be addressed, once named honestly. By the time the hearing ended, the two families had not only resolved the dispute over water, but had agreed to share a harvest festival together for the first time in a decade. Cade watched her handle the room with a quiet pride he did not bother to hide. "You have a gift for seeing what people are not saying," he told her afterward, as they walked together back toward their chambers. "My mother used to say the same thing," Elena replied. "She said healing a person's body was often the easy part. Healing what troubled their heart took more patience." It was not long after this that Doran, once Seraphina's willing conspirator in Thornwood, arrived at the fortress gates under a flag of formal parley, requesting an audience with the Alpha. The pack braced for treachery, memories of the previous winter still fresh, but Doran came alone, unarmed, and knelt before Cade in the very same courtyard where Elena had once returned from her ordeal in the snow. "I do not ask forgiveness," Doran said, his voice rough with something that sounded like genuine shame. "I ask only the chance to correct the harm I allowed myself to cause. Seraphina's ambitions became my own for a time, and I let old resentments blind me to what was right. Our territory's leader has since learned the full truth of what I did in his name, and I have been stripped of my former standing as punishment. I come now only as a man seeking to make amends, however small they may be." Cade studied him for a long moment, Elena's hand resting lightly on his arm, a quiet reminder of the mercy she had shown even to those who had wronged her. "Amends are not made with words alone," Cade said finally. "But I will not turn away a man willing to kneel and admit his failure honestly. Prove your intentions through action, Doran, and in time, trust may be rebuilt between our territories." It was, in its own quiet way, the true end of the conflict Seraphina had set into motion, not through further violence, but through the slow, deliberate work of rebuilding what had been broken, a process Elena found herself deeply involved in over the following months, traveling twice to Thornwood territory herself, to help establish a shared healing exchange between the two packs' infirmaries. Meanwhile, closer to home, a different kind of story had been quietly unfolding. Priya and Callum, who had first grown close during the anxious days of Elena's captivity, found themselves drawn together in the months that followed, their friendship deepening into something neither of them had expected, but both had quietly hoped for. It was Elena who noticed it first, catching the way Callum lingered near the garden longer than his duties required, the way Priya's face lit whenever his name was mentioned. "You could simply tell him," Elena said one afternoon, watching Priya blush furiously over a bundle of chamomile. "It isn't that simple," Priya protested. "He's a tracker. I'm a healer. We hardly move in the same circles." "I was a debt payment who wasn't supposed to stay past sunrise," Elena said dryly. "And now, I am Luna, of this entire pack. I would not put too much faith in circles if I were you." Priya laughed, but the words clearly lodged somewhere important, because within the month, she and Callum could be seen walking together through the fortress gardens in the evenings, an easy, comfortable closeness settling between them that reminded Elena, with quiet warmth, of her own early days with Cade. Autumn returned, marking a full year since Elena had first arrived at the fortress gates in fear and uncertainty, and Cade marked the occasion by taking her once more to the ancient forest, this time not for comfort in the face of danger, but simply to celebrate how far they had traveled together. They sat beside the same stream, the glowing moss pulsing faintly in the fading light, and Cade turned to her, with an expression she had come to recognize as the one he wore, whenever something important weighed on his heart. "I have been thinking," he said carefully, "about what it might mean to expand your garden beyond the fortress walls. A healing house, open to any within our territory who cannot afford proper care, staffed by healers you yourself have trained. It would carry your name, if you wished it." Elena stared at him, momentarily speechless. "You want to build something like that? For me?" "For everyone," Cade corrected gently. "But yes, because of you. Because you have spent a year showing this pack that strength and gentleness are not opposites, exactly as my mother once believed. I want that lesson to outlast us both." The healing house broke ground before the first snow of that second winter, and Elena spent the following spring overseeing its construction, with the same careful attention she gave to her herb beds, ensuring every detail, from the placement of windows to catch morning light for drying herbs, to the layout of beds for patients who needed rest, reflected the values she had carried with her since her mother first taught her to tell healing plants from harmful ones. When it finally opened its doors that summer, Priya was named its first head healer, a position she accepted with tears of pride, and Elena stood beside Cade at the entrance, watching villagers and pack members alike stream through the doors, seeking care that had once been out of reach for so many. "Your mother would be proud," her father said, standing beside her as the ceremony concluded, older now, but healthier and happier than she had seen him in years. "Not because of the buildings or the titles, Elena, but because you have become exactly the kind of person she always hoped you would be." Elena squeezed his hand, unable to find words adequate to the moment, and turned instead to find Cade watching her with the same quiet devotion he had carried since that very first night by the fire, a devotion that had only deepened with every trial they had weathered together. It was in the third year of their bond that Elena discovered she was carrying a child, a discovery that filled the fortress with a joy unlike anything since the wedding itself. Cade, who had faced conspiracies, kidnappings, and the weight of an entire pack's future without ever losing his composure, found himself utterly undone by the news, pacing the length of their chambers with an energy Elena had never witnessed in him before. "You are certain?" he asked for perhaps the third time, kneeling before her chair and pressing his palm gently against her still flat stomach, as though he might feel proof of the news himself. "Odette confirmed it this morning," Elena said, laughing softly at his obvious disbelief. "You are going to be a father, Cade." Something shifted across his face then, joy tangled with an old, familiar shadow, and Elena recognized it immediately, the same fear that had gripped him the night he finally told her the truth of his mother's death. "I know what you're thinking," she said gently, taking his face in her hands. "You are thinking of your mother and your father's grief, and wondering whether loving this child as fiercely as you already do is inviting the same danger into our lives." "I cannot help it," Cade admitted quietly. "The more precious something becomes to me, the more terrified I am of losing it." "Then we protect what we love," Elena said firmly. "Together, with open eyes, rather than closed hearts. Your father chose to close himself off from the world after losing your mother. We will choose differently. We already have. Every single day since that first night by the fire." Cade pressed his forehead against hers, the same gesture he had used so many times before, to communicate what words alone could not fully capture, and something in his chest finally eased, the old fear loosening its grip just enough to let the joy of the moment take its rightful place. The pregnancy brought its own quiet challenges, as pregnancies often do, long nights where Elena found sleep elusive, and Cade, rather than simply offering comfort from a distance, took to reading aloud from his mother's old botany books, until her eyes finally grew heavy, a small ritual that became one of the most treasured parts of those final months. Priya visited often, bringing teas and remedies of her own devising, delighted to finally return some measure of the care Elena had shown her during their early years of friendship. Bramwell, gruff as ever but visibly fond of the coming heir, took it upon himself to begin preparing a small wooden cradle with his own hands, an unexpected act of tenderness from a wolf who had once questioned Elena's very presence within the fortress walls. "Every future alpha of this pack deserves a cradle built with care," he said gruffly, when Elena thanked him for the gift, clearly uncomfortable with the sentiment, but unwilling to take back the gesture. The child, a daughter, was born on a clear winter morning, nearly identical to the one when Elena had first arrived at the fortress gates years before, though this time, the cold outside carried none of the fear that had once accompanied it. Cade wept openly when he first held his daughter, a sight the pack would speak of for years afterward. The fierce and formidable Alpha King, brought entirely undone by a small bundle wrapped in soft blankets. Her eyes, the same storm gray as his own. "What will we name her?" Elena asked, exhausted but radiant, watching him cradle their daughter with a gentleness that belied his considerable strength. Cade considered the question carefully, his gaze moving between his daughter and Elena with an expression of complete and utter devotion. "Marielle," he said finally, "after my mother." It is time her memory was honored with joy, rather than only grief. Elena smiled, understanding immediately the significance of the choice, the way it wove together the pain of Cade's past with the hope of their shared future. "Marielle," she repeated softly, testing the name against the quiet morning light. "It suits her." The years that followed were not without their own small trials, disputes to settle, seasons of drought and abundance alike. Moments of worry, as Marielle grew from an unsteady toddler exploring the fortress halls into a curious child who followed her mother into the garden every chance she got, small hands, eager to learn the same lessons about healing herbs that Elena's own mother had once taught her. But through every trial, the foundation Cade and Elena had built together, patiently, honestly, one difficult conversation and one act of trust at a time, held firm against whatever challenges arose. The healing house Elena had founded grew into one of the most respected institutions in the entire region, drawing healers from territories far beyond Ashbourne land to learn the methods Elena and Priya had developed together over the years. Doran, true to his word, became one of the pack's most steadfast allies, and the peace between Ashbourne and Thornwood territories grew so strong that within a decade, few among the younger generation could recall a time when the two packs had ever been anything but close friends. Ellis, the young guard who had quietly aided Elena during her captivity in the Thornwood camp, had never quite forgiven himself for his part in that night, even though everyone, Elena most of all, insisted he bore no true blame. He had been conscripted into Seraphina's scheme through loyalty to his commanding officer, rather than any hatred of Elena herself, and once the truth of his small kindness came to light, Cade had offered him a choice, rather than punishment: exile from Thornwood territory, or a place within the Ashbourne pack, should he wish to earn it honestly. Ellis chose to stay, throwing himself into his training, with a determination that impressed even Bramwell, who took the young wolf under his wing in the years that followed. By the time Marielle was old enough to toddle after the older pack members through the fortress halls, Ellis had risen to become one of the most trusted trackers in Cade's service. A quiet, steady presence who never spoke of that winter night unless directly asked, and who treated Elena, whenever their paths crossed, with a gratitude too deep for easy words. It was Ellis who first brought word, nearly 6 years after Elena's arrival at the fortress, of trouble stirring along the northern border of Ashbourne territory. Villages reporting livestock stolen and, more troublingly, entire families vanishing from their homes in the dead of night, with no trace left behind, beyond disturbed earth and the faint, unfamiliar scent of wolves belonging to no known pack in the region. "Rogue wolves," Ellis reported grimly, kneeling before Cade in the great hall. "Outcasts, by the look of the tracks, banded together under no clear leadership, though something is clearly coordinating their movements. 3 villages in as many weeks, Alpha. The families are simply gone." Cade's expression darkened, old instincts sharpening immediately. "Missing or killed?" "Missing," Ellis confirmed. "No blood at any of the sites. Whoever is responsible wants them alive, for reasons I cannot begin to guess." Elena, seated beside Cade as she so often was during council matters now, felt a familiar chill settle over her, the same instinct that had once helped her survive her own captivity stirring to life. "Taken alive suggests purpose," she said slowly. "Ransom, perhaps, or something else entirely." Rogue wolves without pack structure rarely organize this cleanly on their own. You believe someone is directing them, Cade said, following her reasoning immediately. I believe it is worth finding out before more families disappear, Elena replied. Cade dispatched search parties within the hour, Bramwell and Ellis leading separate groups toward the affected villages, while Cade himself remained at the fortress, torn between the instinct to ride out personally and the responsibility of protecting his home, his wife, and his young daughter from whatever threat might be unfolding. It was a tension Elena recognized well, the same weight she had watched him carry since the very earliest days of their bond, the impossible balance between duty to the many and love for the few closest to his heart. It was Marielle, unexpectedly, who provided the first true clue. Now 6 years old, with her mother's curiosity and her father's sharp instincts, she had taken to following Priya through the healing house during the mornings when her lessons allowed, absorbing far more of the healer's work than anyone realized, until she mentioned, quite casually over dinner one evening, a peculiar detail from a farmer's visit earlier that day. The man from Miller's Creek said his cousin saw strange marks carved into the trees near where his neighbors went missing, Marielle said, swinging her feet beneath the table, entirely unaware of the way her parents had gone suddenly still. He said they looked like claws but arranged too neatly to be natural, like someone drew them on purpose. Elena exchanged a sharp glance with Cade. Marielle, can you remember exactly what he said the marks looked like? Marielle, delighted to be taken seriously, launched into an enthusiastic and surprisingly precise description, and by the time she finished, Cade was already calling for parchment to sketch what his daughter described, a symbol that Bramwell, upon seeing it days later, recognized immediately upon his return from the northern villages. That is no rogue marking, Bramwell said grimly, staring at the sketch. That symbol belongs to the Hollow Vale territory, far to the north, beyond any lands we have dealt with directly in generations. They were driven from their original territory decades ago, after a bloody succession dispute, and have survived since, as raiders and mercenaries, loyal to whoever pays best. Someone hired them, Elena said, the pieces settling into place with uncomfortable clarity. Someone with enough resources to fund an operation stealing entire families, and enough reason to want it happening quietly, far from any territory that might trace it back to them directly. It took weeks of careful investigation, Ellis and Bramwell working alongside trackers loaned from Doran's territory, in a gesture of the alliance that had grown so strong between Ashbourne and Thornwood, before the truth finally emerged. A minor noble from a distant southern territory, resentful over a trade agreement Cade had negotiated years before that favored Ashbourne interests over his own dwindling influence, had been quietly funding the Hollow Vale raiders, hoping to destabilize the northern villages enough to force Cade into costly concessions, eerily reminiscent of the scheme Serafina had once attempted, though considerably more calculated and considerably more patient in its execution. The missing families, it turned out, had not been harmed, held instead in a hidden camp deep within contested borderlands, kept as leverage for a demand that had not yet been delivered, the noble apparently waiting to see how much damage and fear could be sown before revealing his hand and his terms. Cade rode north himself this time, though not alone, and not without careful strategy learned from hard experience. Elena remained at the fortress, not because Cade forbade her involvement, but because Marielle needed her mother's steady presence, and because Elena herself recognized that some battles were best fought with patience and diplomacy, rather than direct confrontation, a lesson she had absorbed fully into her role as Luna over the years. It was, in the end, Doran's assistance that proved decisive, his territory's forces moving to cut off the raiders' southern escape route, while Cade's own trackers, led by Bramwell and Ellis, closed in from the north. The captured families were recovered unharmed, the Hollow Vale raiders scattered and driven from Ashbourne lands entirely, and the noble responsible, once his involvement was proven beyond doubt through careful investigation, found himself facing the united condemnation of nearly every territory in the region, his influence and resources stripped away through formal channels that Cade, ever mindful of avoiding unnecessary war, insisted upon pursuing, rather than direct retaliation. You could have simply crushed him, Bramwell said afterward, some mixture of admiration and mild exasperation in his voice, as the pack celebrated the safe return of the missing families. Fewer would have questioned it, given what he attempted. Strength that only knows how to crush invites nothing but more of the same in return, Cade replied, echoing, though he did not realize it in the moment, almost the exact words Elena had once spoken about her mother's philosophy of healing. I would rather be remembered as an alpha who chose justice over vengeance, even when vengeance would have been easier. Elena, standing beside him as the pack celebrated late into the night, felt a familiar warmth settle into her chest, the same recognition she had felt so many times before, that the man she had chosen, all those years ago, had only grown into more of exactly who she always sensed he could become. Marielle grew steadily over the following years, her curiosity leading her as often to Bramwell's training grounds as to her mother's garden, a blend of gentleness and strength that reminded everyone within the fortress of both her parents in equal measure. When she turned 12, she asked to begin formal lessons in both healing and pack diplomacy. Determined, she declared with the earnest confidence only a child on the cusp of adolescence could summon, to one day serve her pack exactly as her mother had, through wisdom rather than force alone. You do not need to decide your whole future so young, Elena told her gently, one evening in the garden that had grown, over the years, into something far grander than the small patch of overturned earth Cade had first ordered prepared so long ago. I know, Marielle said, kneeling beside her mother among the lavender, so much like Elena at that same task years before, that it made Cade, watching from a short distance, feel the years pass all at once. But I like knowing what I am working toward. Isn't that what you always taught me? That knowing your own mind is the first step toward choosing your own life? Elena laughed, delighted, and a little undone by how thoroughly her own lessons had taken root. Your mother did teach you that, she admitted, though I suspect I will regret it whenever you decide to use it against me in an argument. Probably soon, Marielle said cheerfully, and Elena's laughter carried across the garden, joined a moment later by Cade's, the sound of a family whose foundation, built through honesty and choice rather than obligation, had proven strong enough to weather every storm that had tested it. Elena often returned, in quiet moments, to the memory of that very first night, the fear that had gripped her, as the carriage stopped outside the iron gates, certain she was walking into a life of servitude and sorrow. She thought too of the morning after, the anger she had felt at being told she could not leave, the sense that her choices had once again been stripped away by forces beyond her control. It would have been easy, in those early days, to assume the worst of the man who refused to let her go. Instead, that refusal had become the first thread in a life woven from patience, honesty, and a bond neither of them had asked for, but both had ultimately chosen, again and again, through every trial that followed. It became, simply, a love story, exactly as it was always meant to be.